a lot of interesting, compelling information. And the last thing that he was talking about was the debt strike to try to avert climate catastrophe if we can. So we assembled this cast of characters: Environmental Coffee House, Black Bear News, Going South, Jennifer Hines, to get out a discussion about whether this is something that's even viable. Can we do it? Can we get the buy-in of hundreds of thousands of people to realize that if we don't, we don't have much time? And from that, Lord, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay, is anybody getting this echo? Because I'm getting a big feedback from somebody. Can everybody on the panel mute, or
we don't have much time?
Is it me?
And from that, Lord, I'm going to give it to you.
Is anybody getting this echo? Because I'm getting a big feedback from somebody.
Yeah, we're going to have to fix that, Torstein.
Okay, I'm going to just have to talk over the echo, but it's really strange. Okay, so, one of somebody amongst our party had this wacky idea of actually doing a debt strike for climate emergency. And the idea is it was really an idea for proposing to XR, Extinction Rebellion. And I don't think it's really in their wheelhouse to pick it up. They're too conservative, it's too radical, and they seem to be on a path to be more conservative. I think they're gearing themselves up to be political animals and turn XR into some kind of green party. And I gather that from, just a few discussions with people who are anonymous, but they sounded on social media like they could be the leadership of XR. So, yeah, I thought that it's worth just discussing amongst ourselves and just seeing if there's any take up, if people want to just at least discuss actually doing this idea. So, okay. What's really on the table? I want to put this proposal on the table, and let's not beat around the bush. Let's just say it as it is. And it's really, ultimately, the aim is to collapse the global economy. Now, if that sounds kind of outlandish and really is really teetering like a drunk, and the chances that it collapses anyway, of its own accord, are very, very high. So I think everybody expects it to collapse in grand style very shortly. Now, it could be induced, I think, with a debt strike, and the participation, I don't know how big it would have to be, and that's one of the research items if we choose to go forward with this crazy idea. But I think something on the scale of what XR just did in these 10 days in London would be enough to basically detonate the entire financial system. Now, the reason for that is a strange quirk, and that's at the heart of this dark satanic machine. They wired up with all their infinite greed something that can only be described as an atomic bomb. In fact, that's not an exaggeration. Warren Buffett described it as financial weapons of mass destruction in 2003. This bomb has actually gone off. People don't really understand, but in 2008, not a lot of people really, and the bomb itself is the derivatives market. Now, to give you a clue of how big the derivatives bomb is, it's actually fairly secret about how big it is. They're very cagey. The central banks are very cagey for the reason that they don't want to spread panic, and they don't want the entire risk. Admits that it's greater than 700 trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, the global economy, the entire GDP of this planet, is 70 trillion. So they admit that it's 10 times bigger than the GDP. Now, nobody believes that. Any serious economist will say it's at least 1.2 quadrillion to 1.5 quadrillion. Now, what the hell are derivatives? And I can tell you quite simply by an analogy. The derivatives market did not exist before liberalization in the 1980s. It's a demon that Reagan and Thatcher created. But when they got rid of Dodd-Frank and they unleashed financialization in the 80s, it launched the derivatives market, and it's entirely unregulated. Now, what derivatives are, think of it this way. Say, Tommy goes into a bar, has a few drinks, and can't pay. So he says to the barman, here, I can't pay for the drinks, but here's an IOU. The barman says, okay, Tommy, I trust you, and Tommy walks out of the bar. Now, what the derivatives market is, imagine the bar is filled with about 500 other people side bets on whether Tommy will pay this IOU back. To give you an idea of why it's so vulnerable is because every time Tommy comes in and gets an IOU, gives an IOU for $1 to the barman, they immediately have side bets to the tune of about $30. So when you go out and buy a house, you get a mortgage-backed security, every dollar of that fixed assets has a minimum of 30, in some estimates 45. People then put side bets on whether you'll actually pay them back. Now, these are all things that range from things that really can be equated to no more than racetrack bets that you'll pay it back, to what you might really call insurance against payback. So a large part of them are things like CDSs, convertible debt swaps. And that means if Tommy doesn't pay back, so the barman can get a CDS, he says, if Tommy doesn't pay me back, then I can switch it with you. You take the bad debt, to somebody else. There are things like interest rate swaps, which are basically, say, Tommy put this bet in dollars, and if the dollar tanks, I'll switch to the yen. They're basically all these kind of ways of hedging risk. At the same time, creating this massive balloon of counterparty debt. So now, why did it implode? It imploded because they reached too far. They reached into the subprime mortgage debt. They're basically people that are not debt worthy. They extended trillions worth of debt to people to buy houses. And it imploded because basically they all turned toxic. They had a formula for working out the risk, and the formula didn't pan out because of why? Real world reasons. And that burnt the entire system down to the ground. Now, why didn't you hear about that, and why do we have an economy? Well, essentially, capitalism ended in 2008. They've covered it up, but what we've been in is a command economy since then. It's essentially a wartime economy. Just imagine we've gone to war, it's been Pearl Harbor, there's no longer competition or fair pricing, prices are set by diktats. Basically, food is rationed, money is rationed, everything is just fake. All the accounting is rationed, we're in wartime, and that's where we've been since 2008. What happened was the major thing they did was they simply suspended accounting rule 157C. And what that said was you have to mark all this bullshit to what its market value is. And that was a GAAP or general accounting principle. Now, they had to suspend that so that everybody could just cheat and say that all the stuff which was now worth zero, the market froze. 1.5 quadrillion market froze on one morning. And they just said, okay, all of us are broke across the board. What we'll do is we'll just suspend the accounting rules, and you can use any reasonable method of accounting to account for all this worthless paper that you now have. And so accountants in general did the easiest thing and say, well, we'll just say it's worth what we paid for it. Since there's no market, it's meaningless what you paid for it. But that's what we've done since 2008. Now, a lot of economists have come and said, you bastards in the banking regulation industry, you caused this whole debacle because we were running a very good crooked operation, cheating each other, and you forced us to do proper accounting. So Accounting Rule 157C only came out about 2 years. It came out about in 2006. So they said it was your bloody fault for making us account properly that caused this debacle. That's how bad this is. But anyway, the point is, everybody is broke. They bailed out people like people that were creditworthy in the major banks, people like Deutsche Bank, but all of them, there wasn't enough QE to bail them out. They've been zombies. All the banks in the world, all the big banks that matter, have been cadavers since 2008. The biggest offender of all is people like Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is in hark to the tune of $55 trillion. Now compare that to the German economy. The German economy, in total, the GDP is 1.2 trillion. So there is no way in hell that Deutsche Bank is viable or ever will be in the lifetime of this planet. But they threw Greece under the bus to cover that up, just so they could pay the interest on essentially 55 trillion. Okay, I hope I'm not going into too much depth here.
I'm wondering if that's why nothing is.
Okay, wait a sec. I gotta switch up my volleys there. Sorry.
Okay.
But they threw Greece under the bus.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Just so. Okay, go ahead. Okay.
I'm just saying, I'm wondering if that's why we haven't tanked yet, because they've basically shown the signs in the last 3 years, right? I mean, Deutsche Bank has been teetering for like 3 or 4 years, but everything is still going, right? That like 3 or 4 years of 2014, 15, everybody was saying, this is it. Here we go. Italian banks were about to fail. German banks were about to fail. They were saying the bubble is about to go, a couple of years ago, and nothing's, everything is, here we are, everything's still going, like, right? That 3 or 4 years.
So they did, right? They absolutely cadavers.
This is it. Here we go. Italian banks were about to fail.
So they are absolutely on the gurney, no life. They are decaying cadavers. What happened 3 or 4 years ago was the veil slipped. Basically, the curtain around the cadavers slipped. So what happened was Deutsche Bank owed a coupon. It's just a tiny little coupon, a meaningless little thing, but it was convertible to Deutsche Bank stock. They couldn't afford the premium on this coupon. We're talking, these guys are so bankrupt, you have to imagine it like a 19th century monarch that has, sold the buttons on their regalia, and then, some monarch relative has to get tin buttons for him so he can come out in public. That's how bad it is. And that's what happened, is basically the kind of mask almost slipped off. Right. So now, what I'm saying to you, not everybody would agree with this assessment. So I think you people, some people know about MMT and modern monetary theorists. Now, these are whack jobs and crackpots that come out of academia, and they say, well, Keynes taught us that you can print money ad infinitum, and there's no wall, there's no limit you can hit. We just print our way out of it. Now, this is complete horseshit, and the reason it's horseshit is for a number of reasons. One of them is that this money is not free. According to the Federal Reserve System, you pay 6%. All of us in America are paying 6% for every dollar that we get from the Fed for quantitative easing, or rather the Treasury does. And so MMT theorists ignore that. They also ignore the fact that you cannot hide the fact that when they do quantitative easing, that money goes to the national debt. And the national debt can only get so big before credit rating in America itself will be downgraded. Now, that's a vicious cycle, because a downgrade in America's debt automatically means that they can't basically borrow. They can't get bonds and give out treasury notes, or the ability to will be downgraded. And that will mean that they will be caught up in another one of our sins that have been going on since 1971, and that's that all this mountain of essentially petrodollars will be repatriated to America. China owes about a quarter of all that America's debt. So the dominoes will fall. If America is downgraded, basically China will fall like a domino, and the rest of the world goes. So there's a lot riding on this little IOU of Tommy's. And they printed their way out with 3 series of quantitative easing since 2008. They can't do it again. They're out of ammo. They can't service the quantitative easing debt that they've got under the current system. And politically, it would be almost untenable for them to basically bail them out again. I mean, there's been too much exposure now. People like Yanis Varoufakis has written books, and there's no one in Greece that is under any doubt that they were deliberately thrown under the bus with 40 years of austerity, and people are suffering here, really suffering. And they're going to be suffering for another 40 years, even though they said, oh, Greece emerged from bankruptcy, it was just propaganda. It's they emerged from the term of a cover letter. They won't emerge from austerity for 2 generations. It's a crime of monumental proportion, because nobody here is in any doubt of the truth. And the truth was that the whole Greek scandal was just to funnel money secretly to Deutsche Bank so that they could keep afloat. Okay, so now that kind of thing is well known around the world. So it's not really possible to print their way out of this one, because also it's politically untenable, because I can't foresee them doing Occupy movement. Occupy movement was a failure. I think central bankers know that there's very likely blood on the streets if they do another Lehman-style bank bailout. Now, okay, that's some bunch of whack jobs, the MMT guys. There's another bunch of whack jobs. The economists will tell you,
follow me.
no, there's no risk. There's basically all the basically guys in the bar that have bets against each other. They all counterparties, and each counterparty has a counterparty risk, so they all net out to 0, therefore there's no risk. Well, that's complete baloney, because it also assumes that the entire debt, the debts are all symmetrical, that Paul owes Peter $1 for a bad bet, and Peter owes Paul $1 for a bad bet. And you can bet that it's not symmetrical, and somebody's out there that really is exposed on a vast one-way bet. They're probably Lehman Brothers galore that nobody knows about, hiding in this woodpile. So that's a nonsense argument. The other argument is all one of these 500 bettors in the bar is actually broke themselves. So they have there were 1.5 quadrillion in bets, and they actually penniless, a lot of them. So they have to, in practical terms, to settle the bets, the losers essentially have to come up with 750 trillion, and there isn't that amount of money in the universe. So it's a bogus argument to say there's no risk in the derivatives market. There's massive, massive risk. The question is, how far can they go papering it up? Now, their exposure is monumental on all fronts, because while they've been holding down the money at 0, made free money, it's allowed people like, basically private equity firms like KKR to do these massive raids. So there've been raids like, for example, Toys R Us. So Toys R Us were decimated because private equity firms like KKR, they came in, they basically do a leverage buyout. They get money at 0%. Because they're big borrowers, they go and buy a place like Toys R Us on leverage. They then load up the company with debt, take huge amounts in fees, then walk away, let the company collapse under that debt burden. And that's what happened to Toys R Us. Everybody else then went, oh, they can't compete with Amazon. No, they can't survive a bear raid is what happened. And that's what's been happening then. There have been bubbles blowing out everywhere. Everybody knows this can't continue. But now the proposal is we start a mass defaults on one of these classes of debt. And so the thing would be a popular debt strike on, I would choose somewhere like November the 5th. And then the aim is to deliberately collapse the economy. Now, why would you want to do something like that? Well, if you have a look at all the things that have worked to reduce CO2, of all the government policies, all the personal initiative, all the individual action, all the collective action, the state action, all the transfer of technologies to get onto LNG from coal and all these things, none of them have worked. Not a single one of them have had any impact on CO2 emissions. To date, you can fact check me on this, but as far as I know, there's only been one thing that reduced CO2 emissions, and that was the collapse in 2008. So when that happened, politicians claimed that it was because of all of the new policies, particularly switching to LNG, which was very convenient for them, natural gas. And particularly Obama claimed all the credit for basically reducing CO2. But he was soon exposed, and by 2010, studies were coming out showing that no, it had nothing to do with the government policies. It was entirely the slowdown, the economic slowdown. Now, the slowdown was immense. It was about 11 to 12% reduction in CO2, which almost exactly matched the slowdown in the economy. And it was conclusively proved that when the economy picked up, CO2 emissions picked up, absolutely correlated in lockstep. So it is a point of fact that the only thing that stops CO2 emissions is a collapse in the economy. So it follows that it correlates exactly. So you can stop CO2 emissions, you can bring them to zero if you collapse economic activity to zero.
Okay.
And
I have one question, if you don't mind. Can you hear me?
I'm getting this massive echo, so I'll try to hear you.
Because there's a lag. Everybody's hearing us later. My only thing is with this is, and it's fascinating since I have been reading and studying about this, is then the personal responsibility and buy-in of a large enough population of people globally that would do this to have it actually happen. I mean, there's, you make a choice of personal, you just say, okay, I'm done and I'm going to do this, but that's your personal finances, your life. And maybe you could help us a little bit understand the individual and how this would work for the individual.
Okay, I just figured out the source of the echo. I had the YouTube thing on in the background, so thank God for that.
Okay, 30 lashes with a wet noodle.
So for the person, so you were saying could it be an individual action to do it?
Well, no, I was actually saying you can't be an individual action, but how would it work? How would we work it with our finances and all that? I know you talked about that on your video, but how also we get the buy-in of enough people to make it happen so that those of us that do it aren't left like in the middle of the road writing these checks to the Treasury and then nobody else does it.
Okay. So I would propose that we do something like this as a game plan. The first thing I would put at the top of the agenda that we need to look at and discuss is the McPherson paradox, and Allais fears that we would lose the global dimming effect. So that deserves some discussion. Then I would suggest that we proceed on to, if we still like what we're hearing, we proceed on to the next stage. And that the next stage would be to do due diligence on all this stuff. And I would propose we do that by having a short list of heavy hitters and celebs, that we, cordially invite to be on our channels. And we draw up a list, we share them amongst the channels, and then through collective action, we basically hound these people till it's easier to have an interview to get rid of us. But the kind of guys I'm thinking are people like David Graeber, who wrote Debt, the First 2,000 Years. He's one of the people that started Occupy. And he's proposed in his book for a debt jubilee. So yeah, he's a fellow anarchist. I don't know him personally. Then there are people like Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert who have been saying, basically this is Armageddon is coming, financially speaking and climatologically speaking, and they tremendous sources. There are people like Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, and he, this is up his this is in his wheelhouse too. Also tipping effects and things like Surowiecki, and wrote books like the wisdom of crowds and things like that. That kind of collective action of crowds. There's also the guy who did, I can't remember his name now, but the guy who started the Pirate Party. He did exactly this kind of launch, and he has a playbook on actually how to do it. So I was just halfway through reading that.
Maybe Torstein knows about that. Do you know about the Pirate Party, Torstein?
Sweden. Yeah.
Yep.
And no, let me see. I think I can quickly look up his name. He's called okay, wait, I'm 2 seconds away from his name. It is Rick Falkvinger. Rick Falkvinger. Yeah.
The audience is saying they can't hear you, Torstein.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yeah, I think everybody can. Oh.
I can hear you fine.
No, they're saying no sound. They can't. No sound. Torstein, can you
I just
audio?
watched his video. I just watched his video tonight. So I just watched the video a few hours ago. So yeah, I was impressed. Yeah, these are the kind of points that I would put next after the McPherson paradox. Is this ethically what we want to do? Personally, I think the tipping point's on the rear view mirror. So for me, why I would say this is morally justified is to raise this topic now. Maybe it's a bit too premature, but I would say that it's going to happen anyway. And so it would be a kind of vehicle to start discussing. I mean, financial meltdown is going to happen anyway. So it would be a vehicle to get the conversation going about just the topics that you're talking about. You see, one of the things about talking to this list of heavy hitters would be to surface all the unknown unknowns. So exactly the kind of things you're saying. And then basically it would be discussed in a rather interesting forum. The mainstream media have established that they can't talk about climate change because it's bad for ratings. I think they can definitely talk about a bunch of people that want to deliberately make an attack on the sacred cow, the economy. I think that is very newsworthy. And on the back of that, we could discuss all these topics which are now outside the Overton window. You will not get a mainstream discussion on what to do with nukes anytime before Armageddon, unless you surface it in this way and couch it in basically these terrorists that are, basically making an assault on the sacred cow.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking today about how you could bring these kind of subjects up politically, into a mainstream conversation, right? I mean, you have politicians in the U.S. saying like, okay, climate change has to be on the table and it has to be a main issue. You have the UK Parliament declaring a climate emergency. You have this political kind of movement and will developing, But the thing is they're obviously not, they're very far from the problems of the McPherson paradox, the nuclear power plants, they're very far away from what actually needs to be done. But at least they're saying, oh, hey, we need to do something. So, yes, how do we get those issues into the conversation as quickly as possible? Because they have to be, because if there's those kind of conversations going on politically, and then you have a meltdown, which I totally see coming, like probably this year, because as gas prices go up, right? Like Michael Rupert said, like the last 2008 wasn't just the mortgage derivatives; it was fuel. It was energy prices going up, sustained, high energy prices for a year, and that drove everything into the ground. So you have these derivatives, huge derivative bubble, and then you have energy prices going all over the place. And if they go up high enough for long enough, then that's it. We could see that happen very, very quickly. But you have to get those things into the conversation as quickly as possible. Like, hey guys, if we have an economic meltdown, who's going to take care of the nuclear reactors? If we have, if we lose all this global dimming, what are we going to do with a sudden 1C rise? Like what, how do we
isn't this the perfect vehicle for that? Because
Yes.
if we can establish ourselves as a bunch of Bader-Meinhof nuts that are trying to rally everybody to deliberately pull the plug on the economy, I mean, I think that is very newsworthy discussion points that, that's a vehicle you can raise these important issues on. I mean, who could not discuss that as a reason for why these nuts should be stopped? And you say, like,
you
people hearing about the McPherson paradox for the first time, they'll be hearing about the nukes. They'll be hearing that, all these green energy solutions are pointless, and hearing interesting facts like, Chernobyl's still a mess. Fukushima is a disaster that is only half done yet. And, all these things that nobody realizes at the moment. They don't know that there are 450 nuclear power stations that are liable to be melted down and can't be decommissioned in 70 years. All these things are outside the Overton window and can't be discussed, but they can in the context of, these freaky nuts that want to destroy the economy. So I think it's great.
I'm interested in feedback from Hambo. He's sitting
Hambo.
back. He's not on the screen, but I'd like to get a little feedback from him on the discussion. Are you there? Hambone?
He's muted.
All right.
There he is.
Oh, there he is.
Now to unmute. Now, guys, as I tried to tell you when we started into this is not my area of expertise. I'm just going to fall back on the old line I've been saying for 9 years. Well, a couple of things. I tore up all of my credit cards 9 years ago. I have not paid 1 penny of interest in my life for 10 years. This is the number one piece of advice I have to anybody out there is stop feeding these sons of bitches behind it all. So we all need to tear up our credit cards. I have no car payment. I have no mortgage payment. That's my number one piece of advice. On one of my very first videos, I was giving that advice. The other thing that I've mentioned many times is Ayn Rand was in 1957. This is, no one talks about the most important passage in Atlas Shrugged. Is when that lefty politician was, the lefty professor was in this heated debate with this industrialist, what I would call a planet eater, and the planet eater was laughing at this. They were the little lefty talking about all the regulations on industry and all of this, and how government and politicians need to take a stronger role on cracking down on the planet eaters. And this planet eater laughed in his face, said, there is one way to put us out of business, and that is to stop buying our products. This was, Ayn Rand, who was defending the obviously the industrialist point of view, and trying to get government regulation off the. I'm sure Donald Trump is a big supporter of Ayn Rand if he could actually read a book. But that's the bottom line, guys. There's one way to put these bastards out of business. It is to stop buying their products. But as the industrialist was saying to the professor, you're never going to do it. All of you little lefty whatevers, it's never going to happen. You're going to sit there and complain and whine about us. You're going to keep buying our products. We're going to keep going right on about our business and laughing all the way to the banksters behind it all. Not a damn thing has changed since 1957, since Ayn Rand wrote that. The problem is 10 times as worse. And again, I fully support any one of these efforts. I am 100% behind you guys. But I joined this, it was November 5th, 2019, for me 10 years ago. And the fact that Hambone Littletail has not paid 1 penny of interest to these evil sons of bitches, I have not noticed one difference in the state of the planet since I made that decision. And so while I encourage you, I assure you, I will be joining you in not paying any debt to any of these people, because I have no debt. I have zero debt in my life. I have had zero debt in my life for 10 years. And that's really all I have to add. This is one of the few times that I can actually say, do as I do.
So Hambone, it's kind of more than that. It's what it really is an intervention, so on other people's crack habit. So in other words, to do this action properly, you would have to really go up and get up to the hilt in debt, and then default on November the 5th. The idea is that you seize up the credit markets. So the effects of that is people won't have the ability to emit CO2 because they won't have the ability to get credit. All the CO2 is emitted on credit. So you would basically, what you're really doing is eroding confidence in the market. So there's risk in the market, and they can quantify that risk. What this is doing is creating uncertainty, and that freezes the market. There wouldn't be a debtor left because there wouldn't be any creditors. Now, one of the major creditors in all of this, or major would-be debtors, is Xi Jinping. He wants to basically save China or preserve his neck by keeping China growing at about 6%. He can only do that with a massive tranche of borrowing, and that's what China is about to do. There's no way they could do it if the credit market was illiquid. So it's a question of basically destroying the crack market. It's not, your example is staying off crack. What we're proposing here is destroying confidence in the crack market. So basically the tables are overturned and everybody vacates the crack market.
I 100% support you on this effort, whether it's going to penetrate the juggernaut or not. I have my doubts. I don't know how I personally can be part of this. I cannot get the credit to buy a big pen on layaway at Walmart right now. I let my credit rating go. So I will not be borrowing any money.
What about the other
death or ever again, as long as I live? Nobody it would be fool enough to. Now, 10 years ago, I could have borrowed $1 million and run it up.
Okay, so this is not really about individual action for us. For us, it's about basically agitprop. So for us, it's basically getting interview candidates, raising the possibility that this will happen. This is not something it's not something that the people in this forum are going to lay their credit rating on the line for. We would be in the business of exploring it as an idea and then promoting the idea as far as possible. So it doesn't require action on our part. It just means that we would have to interview people, explore the idea, publicize the idea. And so I think the way we would interview is with a list of people that we divide amongst all the channels, and then we divvy the people that will be interviewed up. I don't think they're not in a position to actually endorse something like this, but what we would want out of them to quantify the size of how big this action would be, exactly how many participants, and to surface unknown unknowns. Now,
and it would target the banks, the banksters, the big banks, would it not? Is that what you were?
Well, okay, so this is what I'd say is that the smart way is to, I think, and this is all for due diligence and research, but I think what you'd do is you'd take certain types of debt first. So I would say that and medical bills, and those would be the first things you start with. And the reason is there's a broad age demographic in those. If you student loans are ripe to go anyway, because students know that they've been suckered, and they know that unless they're in a STEM job, they're going to go out with 30K of debt after their graduation, and they're going to go out into unemployment, and their credit rating's going to be screwed anyway. So they're primed to default. In a lot of ways, what we're doing here is giving people the right to default with dignity. The credit card debt is, you've got to imagine single parents and moms out there that are going to default anyway. And then the medical bills are basically the senior generation. So if you can get a cross-generational consensus that this has to happen, it's going to happen anyway. So, you are getting people that would default because they're under duress. And you're just saying to them, now we're giving you default with dignity. Now you can do it as an act as a social justice warrior and not as some American loser.
And the one thing about this is, yes, it's a psychological thing, but you start giving up or trying to get people to buy in on, okay, default on your student loan, just don't pay it. And then you have other assets or whatever. How is somebody who really wants to make a difference, not or supposed to live or not be totally frightened, so that we can get the momentum going and saying there's power in numbers. How do you do that?
So it's the collective active action problem, and it's the classic problem that all activists have, is that we know that we can beat the grasshoppers if all the ants will step forward. The question is, no one wants to step forward in case nobody else comes with them. So that's the collective action problem, and it's the classic problem that is all revolutionaries have had to face. Now, this is slightly different for the collective action problem, because it's the threat alone can destabilize the markets. So if you pick a date out far enough, like November the 5th, and then what you do is, I think, celebrities, then I think what we'd do is we would get cells, so it's sort of like cells of, like the Pirate Party, you get cells of 7 people, 1 leader, 1 deputy. What would happen is you try and get those cells to metastasize, but in essence, they would have Tupperware parties where you would get buy-in, and you'd get people to pledge that they would default on their debt, on this date. And or you can have, like in the 80s when they had, after the good times ended in the 80s, people had credit card cutting parties where they take all their friends to the bar, run up their last bill on the credit card, and then cut the credit card up. And so these things you would basically, if you can't pay your debts, you would have one of these parties. You would write a letter of intent to your creditor and say that on November the 5th you intend to default. And then, by the way, to just give you an idea of how bad it is to actually do this letter of intent, I'm not sure, I have to be fact-checked on the legality, but if you send your creditor a letter of intent and say that I'm going to default on some distant date like the November the 5th, your creditor is pretty much screwed. Imagine if a guy who's, he can't do anything about it. You have to fact-check me there on my law. But I think in most states in America, he wouldn't be able to get any more credit, because basically it would be fraud if he's got a letter of intent saying that he's going to get a default on that date. But he wouldn't be able to do anything to the debtor until they fell behind. So they would be roundly screwed for months. And basically that's at the expense of a letter. People can go through with this and just say publicly, just to a poll, they can swear blind that they're going to do this and then not follow through. It's even possible to take this down to November the 4th and just say, hey, just kidding, we'd never do something like that. Because you don't know that once you let this genie, no one knows, once you let this genie out of the box, this monster might just run. The whole point is you're creating uncertainty in the market. They can't price uncertainty. So that alone wrecks the market. So you can get everybody to, do collective action, raise awareness. So after we got like cells of 7 and stuff, I'd say that what they should do would be to try to create other cells, regional cells, and they should go after celebrity endorsement. But if you can get celebrity endorsements, they would, you see, in a lot of ways, you just want to create the threat that it's going to happen. Right, is as powerful as actually carrying through. So you just have to look for ways where people can pledge that they will go through with this, and then everybody has to guess what happens on November the 5th.
Except that we've made this video, and now those people might even be.
No, they can watch this video. Everything I've said. If you were a bankster, you know exactly what I've said, and you still can't tell, right? If people answer a poll, if you educate people to say, whatever you're going to do on November 5th, say you will default, it's as good as defaulting. Now, nobody can with confidence come back and say, yeah, by our estimates, we think that, 50% of these people are jokers, it will implode.
Kevin, what do you think?
Well, I like this idea in general, and I like specifically the letter of intent. Like, that to me seems so like something that's very simple that people can do, and it doesn't involve going to court, and doesn't involve it's, if you can get a bunch of people to do this all at once, I like that. I think it can be effective. And I just want to say very quickly, I don't have a lot of time because I have to make dinner for my daughter. But so I would like to propose another idea in addition to this idea, to the debt default idea. And I don't know why nobody has done this or nobody's tried this, but I've been thinking about it for a while. So we have all these climate strikes. We have people marching. We have days of action on every Friday. We have school strikes. We have a raising awareness. We have a rising tide of, people willing to take action. But what nobody has, so we're all talking about stop fossil fuels, cut emissions, but nobody is boycotting, go to work, or people have to, But what I'm saying is if you could coordinate an oil strike or a gasoline strike in conjunction with these school strikes or with other protests around climate change, it's a very, you know what I mean? Like, gas, we got to stop burning fossil fuels. So let's not buy gas on this day. Let's hit the pockets of the oil companies, right? Let's, we just pick a day. It could be every Friday or every Sunday. We have just a general gas strike. And the oil companies would know on this day that they'd be losing revenue. And that would also shake financially. That would really, if it hurt them financially enough, if you had enough people globally doing this, they would be losing enough money to create, you would create problems in the market from that as well. So I'm not saying starting a fossil fuel strike, like just have a Facebook page like fossil fuel strike and just hammer it along and do it along in conjunction with the school strike. And that is a financial blow to the entire system. And it would probably, I don't know.
Warm up. It's a great warm up for, debt default.
And also would raise awareness, et cetera. So but I like this idea. I like what you're presenting. And I just want to present that idea as well. I would like to put some momentum behind that. And I will, I'll be letting people know when that happens. But
awesome.
If
Work
we can
with us.
It's great training for people to prepare for something like this. It's kind of like a mini strike as a training ground for, a big financial one.
Right. And if we can do, if you can get enough of these pillars of contention in society, we're not going to do this. We're not playing the game, the industrial civilization as it is, and then you can find other ways to do this. You'd have shopping strikes. You can have, whatever you can, you can have, I think the idea of debt jubilee has been out there for a while. So if you raise awareness around a debt jubilee or debt, just taking people out of the debt system, I think, you have people who have been talking for a long time about not paying income taxes. I was just talking to a friend who he doesn't register his car. There's actually there's some kind of legality around you don't actually have to register your vehicle in the United States, but they make you do it. They scare you into doing it. But there's a legal loophole, and I was like, oh my God, if you got a bunch of people to stop registering their cars, you would take out a lot of revenue. You just
Kevin, you've really been thinking about these things.
I've been thinking about this.
The Kevin should actually support this because it's bleeding some of the aggression out of the public, and they looking at the pitchforks. These kind of actions might save their necks. So I can imagine that they would actually support it. Some of the biggest villains might actually support this because it basically take some of the steam out of the
right, and they're off the hook too. Then, yeah.
Wow.
If it's a debt jubilee, like a true debt jubilee, then it's how a lot of people would be behind that. Of course, you're going to crash the system. So
yeah, and I think
anybody who's like, yes, we can do this, it's going to wipe everybody out. So but afterwards, everything will come together again. But
see, what I point out is that people want to do a Green New Deal. They have to burn the system down first. I mean, Roosevelt's New Deal was how to build the system up after it had collapsed. That's why it worked. You can't get a system running flat out and say, hey, we're going to transform it with a new deal. It's, who's going to buy into that?
Right.
You know, if you look at CO2 charts over the last couple hundred years, especially since like 1900, you see right after World War II, right, takes a big dip. And that's when the Roosevelt initiative with the New Deal and everything like that started to ramp up. But that shows the inextricable link between the economy, CO2 emissions, and consequently climate at large. So that's one thing that kind of like occurred to me. And another thing that occurred to me was the interlocking exponentiation of the different cycles that we're on. So we have exponentiation in a lot of different ways right now. We all know, those of us have been watching climate and looking at climate, we're on an absolutely exponential path, and you can kind of see that steep curve. But the same goes for the economy. And I think that occurs to me, Lord Hugh, when you were giving your initial overview and summary, you made some statements about Deutsche Bank. And, you know, it occurs to me that Deutsche Bank's been in the news an awful lot lately as well. I mean, Deutsche Bank's a known money laundering operation. It's extremely corrupt. And, you know, right now, what's happening in the United States is the big Russia probe has come out. And of course, Trump's finances are very, very interlinked with Deutsche Bank. In fact, Trump had gone bankrupt so many times that Deutsche Bank was the only one that would give him money. And Deutsche Bank, I believe, be willing to comment about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're all rotten. So HSBC has actually been prosecuted for supporting terrorists. So they have know your customer. What's it called? Know your own customer, NYOC. But that means a regulation that they force the banks to be self-policing on all these crooks. So if they suspect money laundering and stuff, which basically these scumbags are all doing, or terrorist activity or anything like that, they are supposed to report it. And they not only don't, they've actually participated in being prosecuted. They just did settlements with no complicity. So they did no admission of guilt settlements. HSBC is probably the worst. But Deutsche Bank too, they've been financing outside of sanctions. It's just a complete it's just they banksters. So if you want to read more about that, one person I think we should put on the interview list is Naomi Prince, who's been exposing actually on the terrorist list everybody from Hezbollah to the Saudis. It's rotten to the core. But you'll only bring it down though with collective action. I think they all invulnerable politically, and that's what HSBC and all these guys have proved. They pay small fines, and the fines in no way make it uneconomical to stop the crimes, because the fines are so small compared to the profits that they get from these deals. And there's no criminal culpability. Since 2008, there hasn't been a single prosecution for malfeasance, so much that in previous centuries they would have hung for it. Yeah, it's a reflection on how bad this system is. But this is the way to bring it down, because everybody knows about it. It's all been. This question is, this is not directed at the politicians. In a sense, what you're saying with the debt strike is, you guys are fired. We think you're incompetent and malfeasant, and we're firing you. We're taking action on our own. And I think that's XR's mistake, is they're really elevating the politicians, appointing them as white knights when they're really just carbon criminals. So they're buttering up the ego and burnishing the politicians' halos when they're actually criminals, and they should be dismissing them and bypassing them. And I think that's one of XR's mistakes, and I can only imagine they're doing it because they fancy themselves with some kind of career ambition as politicians, which it's a terrible thing to say they're piggybacking on a climate emergency for some kind of personal, professional ambition, but that's my only conclusion based on their moderate tactics, is they want to make sure they're not unelectable.
You really think
yeah,
so?
I mean, rather than appealing to them, I totally get that. Like, I think you have to suck the energy out of the system in the way, and that's why I was proposing some kind of like strike or boycott, general boycott, because you suck. You start collapsing the system. You start, just like Hambone was talking about, you stop buying their shit. You stop, and I don't see boycotts being done very rarely. There's Sean King has done some boycotts. He's a Black Lives Matter activist, but he's the only person I've seen organizing boycotts in the last 10, 20, 30 years. Like, it's just something that people don't engage in, and it's really damaging. It's very damaging to the system.
The boycotts are very, very we kind of realized about the power of boycotts. So there are a number of things that boycotts is they must be targeted. So and also you can put some demand on it. So then you say, like, you have a fuel boycott with the aim of getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidy. I mean, can you believe that there's still
right
fossil fuel subsidy, for God's sake? They're not even trying. And you say that it's for that. But the other thing is you can create supply shocks. So, for instance, you can run up. So everybody has, a massive run up as a prelude to basically the strike. And what that does is it creates a supply shock that can be fatal for the supply line. So in other words, people will restock shelves of a certain item and they will build up inventory so that when the strike comes, they're left with all this inventory and it becomes a nightmare for them. So much so that you can take down a big corporation with a big enough, supply shock.
Yeah. But
as the protest gets more and more sophisticated, you can start doing these things. But the thing about boycotts, they're nasty in South Africa. It got to the point where people that shopped on the shopping days, they would be forced to, say, drink products that they bought at the supermarket, from bleach to,
wow.
Russian powder, and that they were force-fed them. And so it can get brutal, but the point remains is you can do everything from social shaming to all the way to tire burning people for being scabs.
Right.
Strike breakers, but all of these things are late. The thing is to introduce the public. The main thing about a debt strike is to show them where the on-off button is to the economy, so they have the power to threaten a debt strike.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think at this point we should discuss what we should do next. I mean, I would propose that we get this list together. We will pitch in with a pool of interview candidates, and then we figure out a way of divvying them up. I mean, that's where I'd like to go next. Is everybody up for this? And take a temperature check at this point?
Okay, well, I'll speak first about up to it. I think that starting online, a boycott type of thing, Kevin, with all of our channels, everybody's voice, start with something small to roll up to the letter of intent to default day in November. And I'd be absolutely willing to do what's within my, limitations, and I will, as far as, because I think that some kind of wake up call has to happen, but I'd like to work in concert with Kevin and Torstein, because this has to go worldwide. This just can't be like, 52 American doomers. I mean, this has to be something that we get everybody familiar with and lead up. And then the letter of intent has to be written. Does it have to be written legally? Can it be just written professionally with certain specific things in it? So we have a lot of planning if this is going to be pulled off, and people have to join us. They have to believe in this, that we can do.
Well, I think at this stage we're still just chatting. So we just in due diligence, and I really like the idea of due diligence by talking to these personalities, because there's some fascinating interview subjects. This is new stuff. I haven't heard any stuff like this, and it's like Torsten was saying. On the back of this, you can introduce some very fringe subjects that should be mainstream, and they're just not. And I would love to hear what somebody like Yanis Varoufakis would say about, the McPherson paradox. I bet your ass he's never heard of it. And it would, he's got real clout. Yeah, I did have a small email exchange with him, but and not enough to warrant an interview and stuff. I'm not really in contact with him, but I just
we need to get scientists on board.
Well, how do we physically assemble this list, and how do we divvy it up?
Well,
Lord, Hugh, just so you know, I mean, getting the people to interview is 90% of the work. The interview is at least on Collapse Chronicle. That's the fun part. I have a fellow down in Brazil who helps me with this. It's unbelievable what it takes to just the amount of work. I mean, I am all ears, but I admit this is a little. I'm fully going to admit this is a little bit out of my league, and I'm not going to be running in the circles where the people who could talk to me intelligently about this are going to come across my radar in my regular life. You are very welcome. I am always encouraging people to send me. So if you can send me some ideas, but I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to generate. I will be.
But you can talk about it. You can
very happy to listen to your ideas. And after I vet them and contact them, if they're up for it, I would be happy to participate. Would
it work if we came up with a list and then just try and solicit them through collective action? So we get, everybody involved to try and guilt, persuade, pressure them.
and we can also like do it, document the pressure, like Michael Moore style, right? Like Roger and I, like trying to get in touch with these people, but maybe we don't get in touch with them. But it's like we tried to call them, we tried to email them, we tried to go to their building, we tried to hound them, and they're, this is what they said.
Well, Michael Moore is coming from an adversarial position usually, Kevin, which is fine.
But I'm saying is like we can kind of shame them. We can shame them a little bit if they're not going to get into it. We can say,
Kevin,
like,
you have musical connections. You have LA connections. Jennifer has connections in the science community. Torstein has connections all over the world. So I suppose if we do sit down and make our own lists, at least to start, I guess it could.
What do you think about pooling the lists? And then we take them one, we say, this is, divvy them up somehow. We say, this is Sandy's preferred interview candidate. Then we all collectively try and get their attention just by weight of numbers. Because we're all small fry, and these guys, the guys I would like to have on my list are probably we're punching out of our league by a long shot. But I think they could be pressured to do it if there are enough people and enough channels. So if there's a big enough base and it looks like it's popular enough, I think that we could possibly get their attention.
Would we have any printed media to proliferate? I mean, would somebody be responsible for writing our mission statement or something? Are we going to go?
I think we're just putting a toe in the water now. I mean, I really say that what we're doing is due diligence to decide just how big a movement would have to be to achieve the result of, basically a collapse of the derivatives market through default. So that and finding all the unknown gotchas. But I think that's all the commitment is at this point. It might be nice to have something up on Reddit or something so we could actually coordinate just hounding these people, just recruiting them for interviews.
Hey guys,
for an audit trail. Yeah,
I apologize. I have to go. I apologize, but I want to continue the discussion, and I think a Reddit idea is, Reddit thread is a good idea, but I have to go right now. So, thank you for the discussion,
and thank you for your contribution.
Keep up the good fight, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great suggestions. Yeah. So one of the things that I think would be valuable is if we kept a very public record of everything we did, even if it doesn't go very far with us. It is basically basically a body of research for other people who want to try this can learn from what we do, as long as we make our strategies public and everything we do as public as possible and record it
via a Reddit list. Is that what
I
you're
mean,
saying?
I
So
like
we set
Reddit.
up a
I
list.
Reddit.
Okay.
I like Reddit. I don't know what everybody else feels. I mean, what does the audience feel? I mean, can we ask?
Yeah, that's where I usually get the majority of my ideas come from my own listeners. They are the sources for people writing in and asking me to please interview this person. That is the number one way that I find my interviewees. But I admit that this is a little bit of an esoteric topic, and I don't think that either one of my channels is going to be flooded with recommendations from my listeners about this. But again, brother, I am all ears, and so if you want any names you come up with, I mean, that is as long as they pass my muster, and then I get the second opinion from my fellow in Brazil. As long as we are both for it, I'm happy to do it, and that's really all.
What channels do your viewers? What channels do your viewers use to recommend people or request?
Well, mostly Collapse Chronicles. Now I run all my interviews on both of my channels, on Collapse Chronicles and Humpty Dumpty Tribe, but they are originally aired on Collapse Chronicles.
And how do they communicate with you, through the comment section, or do they send you emails, or
both? Either just through public comments on the page or private emails. I get both. Yeah.
So where can we have a place that has a good record? I mean, Reddit makes sense to me because we can have a poll at the end of it to say,
Torstein's already got it set up. It's our Collapse on Reddit, and we'll all join it and get in. And everybody that's watching this can get in on it, and we can have a lot of voices in conversation all together.
That's and another excellent place is LinkedIn, believe it or not.
No, I don't want to use LinkedIn.
No, I don't like LinkedIn.
It's too corporate. No friggin' way am I using LinkedIn. Nope.
I'd hate LinkedIn.
You would be shocked, Sandy, how many doomers are going in on LinkedIn.
Yeah, but that's a professional site, and I don't want to do that. But I don't think a lot of us would want to.
Well,
what do you think of all this?
For me, to be honest with you, it's a big thing to take on board, and it's difficult because I've been very committed to my finances and leading a responsible life, and being independent and successful and all things like that. And it's a hard idea for me to take on board.
And that's okay. There's a lot of us that feel that way. I mean, we have a lot to lose, but just what, Lord, you said about threatening with a letter of intent type of thing could be just what we need to start with.
Yeah, nobody knows whether you carry through with this or not, right?
No.
It's really about activism. I wouldn't ask for personal commitment from anybody to carry through with this.
Yeah, well. That the quote threatening or the Michael Moore adversarial position is not my MO at all. It's
a letter of intent.
It's an invitation to be interviewed, and as much as I would like to get in screaming matches with half of my guests, I mean, I'm going to approach it from a very polite and I'm not going to come at it from an adversarial position.
Well, that wasn't really the way a letter of intent would be. It would be a professionally written letter just stating fact This is my letter of intent. I intend to default on my debt on November 5th, 2019, and whatever else that sounds a little bit, official, legal, whatever, but it would be respectful and professional. This is a professional thing to do. It's not just being
we're not
adversarial.
talking about threatening the interview candidates. We're talking about threatening the
all right,
establishment.
I just wanted to make okay. I just wanted to make sure we had communication on that, brother. That
We could even call
we're
this
trying to make the
worldwide.
establishment shiver in their boots. We're not trying to make interview
Yeah.
candidates.
It could be Worldwide Letter of Intent Day.
there you go. So
we don't want
guys, as I say, y'all can keep me in the loop, but I'm going to sound somewhat like Jennifer that I have got so much on my plate.
And so do we all. So that's why we're just fleshing it out.
I am glad to be of assistance, but I'm not going to commit to being really proactive. I'm glad to join you, but you guys are going to have to do the legwork and then bring me in as a comrade. I'm glad to join from that perspective.
That works. I mean, it's whatever amount of commitment you want works with this because it's really flexible.
We could bring the indigenous communities in. I think they might be interested in this because they're in a lot of actions.
Yeah, I got a comment on my video from somebody that I asked her if she would be an interview candidate because she was straight out of that
Liz
fight.
Gilbert?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all in the same circles. We all know each other.
Yeah, so she said some amazing stuff. I think that would definitely be it because I think that there are a lot of people, basically on the forefront of this debt war. We're all pretty liberal and comfortable bourgeois, I'm afraid, this group. But there's a lot of people there on the front lines of a debt struggle. And so, maybe we should find out about their story. That would be interesting. So you mentioned about collapse thing. So Torsten, you actually the moderator on collapse? Yeah. Oh.
But are you the one who spearheaded that, Torstein? You're not the one who started that, are you? I know. I would be shocked if you had not.
Definitely.
I just got an email from them literally since we went on air. An email has just come in finally that I have been approved as a commentator because it's been real hard for us to post. My buddy in Brazil just said, "Screw it." It's so hard for him to post my interviews from Collapse Chronicles. He just said he's not willing to do the job. It's such a hassle to post an interview. I'm a complete Luddite. I think I ran you an email. I would absolutely love you to take on the task of posting, even if you want to rip them and put them on your channel and post them from your channel. I just want them up there, and they're not getting posted because I don't know how to do it, and my buddy in Brazil, he knows how to do it, but he says for how much hassle it is, he's not willing to. So I wish they could make it easier to post things on there. Well, you should see me try to slice bread. I cannot slice bread. You know it. All that
Let's not
anyway, I'm not posted. I would
we're not
love to be
starting a
posting my
technical
stuff.
conversation with
Anyway,
Dan
well, this is
Campbell
getting
right now.
beyond the purview of our conversation, but anyone who wants to post my interviews on Reddit Collapse, by all means, the job is available.
Okay, we got one tech support job going. Do we have any votes for what forum we manage this in? And is anybody up for this?
I don't know about managing, but I will join the Reddit collapse that Torstein was talking about, even though nobody could hear him except us. And then maybe everyone else will come on board. And that's already a established group with like
Yes.
zillions of people. So we could join in with this video as the introduction to us. What do you think, Torstein? Just go yes or no because nobody can hear you.
Okay, so we manage this on Collapse then?
Sure, and we'll communicate more, and we'll tell everybody what's going on. And I
Okay,
think
so I'll post soliciting interview candidates, shall I? So we get a pool, and then should we match it up with the channels that Osama got? Osama number 5, he got a long list of channels that might. Okay, so all right, let's do it on Collapse then. Is that motion carried? Do I have a second?
I
will second that one. If you find someone to do it.
Okay, well that's cool. I mean, I think that's everything that was on the agenda to cover in this. So let's post this video and pick it up in Collapse and carry on from there. I think that's awesome.
Torstein.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Carthage? You want to bomb Carthage?
Carthage
Are you Roman?
You said Carthage should be burned? Bombed?
I wish people could hear you.
Yeah. Let's Yeah. So, okay. So first off, I'd say this truly is what you say. It's setting a match to burn the house down. Now, from my point of view, I think we're in a gulag. I think we're in a labor camp, and it's going to turn into a death camp before climate emergency is through with us. So what I characterize it as is we're in a basically Auschwitz situation, and it's a difficult ethical question because I'm saying that we torch the whole death camp. This is really a proposal to torch the death camp. Now, the first objection is who's going to feed us? The kitchen's going to go with this. And so, yeah, we are preempting the end of the death camp. We're also basically imposing suffering on everybody. It's torturous, ethically speaking, because if you let it run, I think we're all going to wind up in a gas chamber, effectively. The equivalent thereof, the establishment will eventually manage our extinction in, a brutal way. We're looking at the Four Horsemen. We're looking. See, one of the things involved in this, in a death strike, is also what it would remove the ability for these bastards to make war. And there's every sign that they're going to war. I mean, before John R. Bolton has finished his term, I can imagine at least 3 wars will be chalked up on his bedpost. And they're moving a carrier into the Gulf now, which is a clear move for mobilization against Iran. So I think Iran, Venezuela, and China are slated for war. We're moving towards war with them. And this might remove their ability to wage war. So it's immensely complicated. But you are right, in essence. It's very serious. Yeah, well, you see, this is the thing. There is, I make the point that it is preparation. So in my view, okay, this is where I'm at. I think we're past the tipping points. For me, this is psychologically important. For one thing, to prepare people so that basically when the shock happens, you can blunt the shock. Just because people have been aware of it, there's a lot of psychological evidence that if you prepare people in advance, when the actual event happens, it's not as painful as they. That's why the doctor says to you, this may hurt, because there's a lot of clinical evidence that if he says that first, that when it hurts you, it's not as bad as if he just walks up behind you and jabs you in the arm. We're about to get a jab in the arm that humanity's never had before. So the argument is that if people know about it in advance, and hence the discussion of what we're opening up a discussion and trying to make it as mainstream and wide as possible, that creates awareness, which reduces pain. The other thing is, if they cause or are perceived even to have caused the collapse, so that's psychologically a lot more positive than if they are victims of a collapse. So even if the death strike and the collapse happened more or less simultaneously, or at least in some kind of conjunction, it would be hard to tell if one caused the other. I imagine that kind of thing would be hotly debated. But you can imagine it in terms of the conservative and the mainstream media dialogue, because it would be, was the ship so rotten that it sank, or was it the bastards that torpedoed that sank it? But either way, you're over the climate change denial stage by far, just by the fact that you forced them into that conversation. And I like the idea of giving people the positive power. So basically, they will feel like giant killers. Most people don't know that the economy is teetering on the brink, and it's a Jenga castle that's about to implode, and it's a staggering drunk that's going to fall flat on his face anyway. So they will feel that by a collective action, they knocked over this giant. They will feel like Jack the Giant Killer. And I think that prepares them well for the next stage where we're going to have to get resilience into the system. There are other things like the mass production and mass distribution food system. And essentially, people don't realize that behind all these brands on the shelf, there are only 5 centralized food companies. So from a food security point of view, we're in a dismal state, and we should be, basically localizing crops and getting rid of mass agriculture. So a collapse of the system forces people into things like homesteading. It forces people to recover some of these crops. Some of these crops, in fact, all of the crops, really the grain crops that we survive on, only survive with the Haber-Bosch process, with fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides. They are a tool of industrialization. They're inseparable from a mass production system. We have to get off those crops and recover some of the older crops that are more diverse, more resilient, more nutritious. And you can only do that by doing local scale farming. So basically, just your Dr. Smith video that I just watched now, he raises that point, and he says that Grandma survived the Depression because she sourced her food locally from her victory garden in the back. So we have to go through that, because if there's going to be a collapse, I don't think anybody can deny there will be a collapse anyway. It's very important that people start recovering these skills early. They start thinking about homesteading, just answering questions like, what do you do in these vast states that could not possibly support their populations with victory gardens? You're raising some, highlighting things like what has happened to other people. If you take like Bosnia, in Sarajevo, they were under fire, and they started victory gardens. They were under conditions that we're probably likely to face in some of the Duma scenarios. And they did wonderful things. They pulled together, they helped each other, although they were starving, although they had to walk through sniper fire to just harvest food in their victory gardens. They had victory gardens on their balconies. They became resilient and helped each other with seeds and food in the midst of starvation. It's important that people realize this and have a model for what's coming, because there are some bleak scenarios. You just have to look at some of the prepper channels to see how these guys are planning to tackle, the shit hits the fan moment, and it's gruesome. I mean, there are some very dark ways to go. And people that came out of experiences like Sarajevo, they said, although they were starving, there were a lot of people killed under siege in Sarajevo. There were also fantastic humanitarian stories, and the best of humankind came out. I think that people have to be told about models like that to make sure that people can live those and not do this lager mentality and hunker down in a bunker. I think that Dr. Smith is absolutely right. The very rich that go and try and scuttle away on planes to New Zealand, I don't think they're going to get on those planes. Those planes are going to be stolen out from under them by the crews, and they're going to have a knife in their back before they get to the getaway plane. And so the very top and the preppers and the bunkers, I know what happened to them in South Africa. We were heading for genocide, and those guys had to line their kids up and shoot them one by one in front of the rest of the family. That's how they went out. So I think we should start discussing these things now, because the examples for what happens all over the world, but the discussion at the moment, if you look in the prepper community, it's absolutely dismal. It's juvenile. It's polluted by Hollywood bullshit. It's nothing like what we're going to be going through, and it's so unnecessary. There's real evidence. They're real people. You could get people from Sarajevo to tell you what these situations are like. No one wants to do that.
Not only Sarajevo, but Serbia and all these other countries. Thing is, how do you get the buy-in? It can't just be. I mean, in this. How do we get the buy-in? And I guess we'll have to flesh this out of the global.
But we start small. We just start with us. Start with us, and just. I mean, it's a conversation, right? That's all it is at the moment. It's just exploratory, and we must explore these things. I mean, I would put number one is the real gotchas like climate gotchas like McPherson paradox. But number two is exactly what Torsten says: it's a moral quagmire. I see it as a moral obligation to burn down, the concentration camp that you're in, because it's a known death camp, and your first obligation is to burn that down and worry about how everybody gets fed tomorrow. But of course, you're taking action on
stuff there.
Right? But that's where we headed. You see, I mean, that alone is, people have got to start thinking about this. That people, I mean, Brexit is really underneath it all. I believe is the government's preparing for these kind of climate emergencies and mass migration, and they thinking in terms of, well, we must establish the channel as a crowd control barrier. And Trump's doing the same with the wall. It's not all a xenophobic scratch that he wants to itch. It's genuine crowd control because they're expecting, masses of caravans coming up because of climate emergencies. And I'm seeing them preparing for these kind of events. And people should be asking from imports. And you should start thinking about scenarios like maybe you're the immigrants. You might have to be, emigrating your population so that, Britain can survive as an island. It's kind of arrogant to think the pound's going to be able to support everybody and the food system's going to collapse and they will still be feeding, 60 million people in Britain. Those people might have to be exported to Canada. They might be the refugees. So I don't know. I mean, I think all these topics should be discussed at this point. And although there's so many doomers around, nobody's discussing the really hard shit. But I mean, who on this channel denies that we're not going to see something like Sarajevo in our lifetime? Live through it. Does anybody want to pledge that?
Driving through areas where the trees are dying, and I see nothing changing in the covering up of every single green space possible with concrete and buildings. I don't see anything that is remotely showing me that there's any kind of change in the capitalist industrial civilization we live in.
So I think we know that it's safe to say it's one of these situations where you know for certain what happens. You know that there's collapse. It has to come because this cannot go on. What we don't know is when. But I'm saying, man, we should be having about the house and the cat. It's these hard conversations, right?
That's right.
Great suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll be uploading this to G Drive, and I'll just send you guys the link on the same email that I sent you the invite.
Great. Well, everybody wishes they could hear you. I've been trying to type out what you've been saying. Well, then perhaps we have accomplished what we set out to do for this evening, and we should bid everybody adieu and thank Sam and Kevin, who had to leave, and Torstein and Jennifer for setting this whole thing up, and Lord, you for being this inspirational brain that popped in out of nowhere, but got us all very much involved in some different kind of thinking and strategy than we had been before.
I'm so pleased how it's come out. I mean, I think we covered so much, and we might be pilloried for some of, well, I might be pilloried for some of the stuff I've said, but I don't know. I mean, I think some people are in a rut in the Doomer community, and they're looking for an advance in the conversation, and I think this is it, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Jen?
Let's hope so.
Yeah,
Let's
well,
hope
it's
so.
definitely new territory. And more than anything, it's putting together so many more dots. You know, it's joining in the economy with abrupt climate change and with CO2 and the relationships intertwined between all of them. And it's irrevocable and it's sad. And I always have such mixed feelings. Having these conversations, it's enlightening and sad and difficult all at the same time.
But that's why we
Yeah.
also have support, and we have those people out there that are developing all the support networks for this community. So avail yourself.
Absolutely.
Not alone. You're not alone. We're all here together, aren't we?
Yeah, this is how I think we develop support. Yeah.
Hambone, you still there?
My last word, as always, keep up the good fight and get out there and enjoy it while you still can. I don't know what else to say. When you boil it all down, that is all that's left to say. Keep up the good fight and get out there and enjoy it while you still can. Thanks, guys. There's that too.
Peace, everybody.
Let's
Peace
go.
out. Thanks for coming.
Awesome. Thanks again.
All right. The recording is stopped.
You sure?
The
Woo!
recording is stopped.
Boy, I think
We're totally bombed.
No, not at all.
secret police
Not
are
at
gonna come
all.
get all of us.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks. I really, way past my expectations. So it's so nice. But
So where'd you come from? How did you start
not this planet.
Just give us 5 minutes of your background a little bit.
I don't do countries very well. I was born in South Africa.